In the deep quiet of a medieval dawn, when the world lay wrapped in mist and the first birds had yet to stir, Eleanor opened her eyes to the familiar weight of another day that would demand every moment of her waking hours. The cottage around her breathed with the soft sounds of sleeping family, her husband William's steady breathing beside her, the gentle rustling of their 3 children on their straw mattresses, and the ever-present whisper of wind through gaps in the wooden walls that no amount of careful construction could completely seal. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned down to glowing embers during the night, and Eleanor knew that her first task, as it had been for every morning of her married life, was to coax those dying coals back to flame. Without fire, there would be no warmth, no cooked food, no hot water for the countless tasks that filled her days, from sunrise until long after sunset, painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor slipped from beneath the woolen blankets that had kept her family warm through the night, her bare feet finding the familiar path across the cottage floor to where the fire waited for her patient attention. The stones of the hearth held some warmth from yesterday's flames, but the morning air carried autumn's chill that spoke of harder seasons to come. She knelt before the hearth with the reverence of someone who understood that fire was life itself, in a world without modern conveniences. From the carefully gathered pile of kindling that she had prepared the evening before, Eleanor selected the driest pieces, arranging them with the precision of an artist creating a masterpiece. The coals, still holding yesterday's heat in their glowing hearts, needed only the gentle breath of bellows and the patient feeding of small twigs to bloom once again into the flame that would sustain her family through another day. As the fire caught and began to spread its golden light across the cottage walls, Eleanor felt the familiar satisfaction that came from this daily victory over darkness and cold. But even as she savored this small triumph, her mind was already moving ahead to the dozens of tasks that awaited her attention. The fire was just the beginning, the foundation upon which she would build another day of endless labor performed, with skill, patience, and the quiet dignity that marked the lives of medieval women who kept their families fed, clothed, and sheltered through their own ceaseless efforts. The growing firelight revealed the cottage that served as Eleanor's kingdom, and her prison, her sanctuary, and her workplace all in one. The single room held everything her family owned and needed for survival: wooden bowls and spoons carved by William's patient hands, iron pots blackened by years of use over the fire, baskets woven from willow branches that Eleanor had gathered herself from the stream bank, and the countless small tools and implements that made medieval life possible. William stirred on their bed as the fire's warmth began to fill the cottage, and Eleanor knew that soon he would rise to begin his own day of labor in the fields that belonged to their lord. But before he woke fully, before the children began their morning chatter, Eleanor treasured these few quiet moments when the cottage belonged to her alone, and she could gather her strength for the day ahead. The water bucket by the door held what remained of yesterday's supply, drawn from the village well in the evening when the day's heat had passed, and the walk across the common ground was pleasant rather than arduous. Eleanor measured the water with her eyes, calculating what she would need for cooking, for washing, for the dozen uses that water served in a household where every drop was precious and had to be carried by hand from its source. The bread that would break her family's night fast sat wrapped in clean linen on the wooden shelf that held their few dishes. Eleanor had baked this bread 2 days ago in the village's communal oven, mixing flour ground from grain that she and William had helped to harvest, kneading the dough with hands that bore the permanent marks of her daily labor, and watching carefully as the loaves baked to the perfect golden brown that spoke of nourishment and care. As the cottage filled with the fire's gentle warmth and the promise of another day dawned outside the shuttered windows, Eleanor began the preparations that would feed her family before they scattered to their various labors. From the iron pot that hung from a hook above the fire, she would make the porridge of oats and barley that provided the foundation of their morning meal, stirring the mixture with a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. But even as she moved through these familiar motions, Eleanor's thoughts were already ranging ahead to all the tasks that filled her days with purposeful activity. The vegetable garden behind the cottage needed weeding and watering. The chickens required feeding, and their eggs needed gathering. The spinning wheel waited patiently for the hours she would spend transforming raw wool into the thread that would become her family's clothing. The children's clothes needed mending where active play had torn seams and worn holes. The house needed cleaning, from the stone floor that collected the dust and debris of daily living to the wooden surfaces that required regular scrubbing to prevent the rot and decay that could destroy precious household goods. Beyond these daily necessities lay the seasonal work that could not be postponed or ignored. Herbs needed gathering for the medicines that would see her family through winter's inevitable illnesses. Vegetables required preserving for the months when fresh food would be scarce and expensive. Wool needed processing through the long chain of cleaning, carding, spinning and weaving that transformed fleece into fabric. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cottage's small windows, Eleanor fed the growing fire and prepared to wake her family for another day of the endless cycle that sustained medieval life. She carried within her heart the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had performed these same tasks, who had found meaning and purpose in the daily round of labor that kept families alive and communities strong. In the gentle glow of the morning fire, surrounded by the tools and implements of her craft, Eleanor embodied the quiet heroism of medieval housewives who transformed raw materials into the necessities of life through patience, skill, and the kind of love that expresses itself not in words but in the endless provision of food, clothing, and shelter for those who depended on their ceaseless efforts. The day stretched ahead of her, filled with challenges and satisfactions, difficulties and small triumphs, but she approached it with the confidence of someone who had mastered the arts of survival and found in that mastery not just competence, but a deep sense of purpose that connected her to the eternal rhythms of human life, to the needs that never change, and to the satisfaction that comes from work performed with skill and dedication in service of those we love. As the cottage filled with the warmth of the morning fire, and the children began to stir on their straw mattresses, Eleanor began the intricate dance of fire and water that would orchestrate her entire day. Every task she performed would depend on the careful balance between these two essential elements: the fire that provided heat for cooking and warmth for living, and the water that made possible everything from bread making to washing to the preparation of the countless meals that sustained her family through their daily labors. The iron pot that hung from its hook above the flames had been her constant companion through 7 years of marriage, its blackened surface bearing the evidence of thousands of meals cooked over the hearth fire. Eleanor added water to the pot with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to measure by sight and experience rather than by the standardized measurements that would not exist for centuries to come. Into the warming water went the oats and barley that would provide her family's morning meal, the grains swelling slowly as they absorbed the liquid and the fire's gentle heat. Eleanor stirred the mixture with a wooden spoon that had been carved by William's father and passed down as part of their marriage portion, its smooth surface worn by decades of use in the preparation of countless meals. But porridge was only the beginning of Eleanor's morning relationship with fire and water. The bread that would accompany the morning meal needed warming by the fire's edge, its crisping as the heat penetrated the dense grain that had been ground at the village mill. The small beer that provided safe drinking for her family required careful heating to just the right temperature, warm enough to be pleasant, but not so hot as to destroy the gentle fermentation that made it wholesome and nourishing. Young Thomas, her eldest son at 8 years old, had learned to help with the morning fire tending, adding small pieces of wood with the careful attention that Eleanor had taught him. Fire was not a servant to be commanded, but a partner to be respected, capable of providing life-sustaining warmth and cooking heat, but equally capable of destroying everything a family owned if treated carelessly or without proper attention. 5-year-old Mary sat on her mother's lap as Eleanor worked, learning through observation and gentle guidance the countless skills that would someday make her capable of managing her own household. The child watched with serious attention as Eleanor judged the porridge's consistency, adjusted the fire's heat, and moved through the morning routine with the fluid efficiency that came from years of practice. Little Anne, barely 3 years old, played contentedly near the fire's warmth, her games supervised by her mother's watchful eye, even as Eleanor's hands remained busy with the morning's preparations. Medieval children learned early to live safely near the open flames that provided heat and cooking fires, developing an understanding of fire's dangers alongside an appreciation for its essential role in family life. Water featured in every aspect of Eleanor's morning work, but each use required its own careful consideration and planning. The water for cooking needed to be clean and fresh, drawn from the village well, where the community's supply was carefully maintained and protected. The water for washing dishes could be reused from cooking, heated until it was hot enough to cut through grease and food residue. The preparation of her family's morning meal revealed the sophisticated understanding of nutrition and food preparation that medieval housewives possessed, despite their lack of formal education or written recipes. Eleanor knew exactly how long to cook the porridge for optimal texture and nutrition, when to add the pinch of salt that would enhance the grain's natural flavors, and how to judge by sight and smell when the meal had reached perfection. William rose from their bed as the scent of cooking porridge filled the cottage, his movements careful and deliberate as he prepared for another day of labor in the fields that belonged to their lord. Eleanor served him his portion in a wooden bowl that she had received as a wedding gift, the vessel carefully carved and polished to a smooth finish that would serve the family for years to come. The children gathered around the wooden table that served as the center of their family life, their faces serious with the hunger that came from a night's fast and the promise of a day's active work ahead. Eleanor served each child according to their size and needs, understanding instinctively how much food each required to sustain them through their various activities. As her family ate the breakfast she had prepared, Eleanor began the mental planning that would organize her day around the countless tasks that required her attention. The fire needed constant tending to maintain the heat necessary for cooking and warmth. Water needed to be conserved and reused whenever possible, while ensuring that fresh supplies were available for drinking and food preparation. The dishes from breakfast would need washing in hot water, warmed over the fire, the wooden bowls and spoons cleaned carefully to prevent the staining and odors that could make eating unpleasant. The iron pot required special attention to prevent rust and maintain the smooth cooking surface that made it invaluable for food preparation. Beyond the immediate needs of breakfast, cleanup lay the longer-term demands of fire and water management that shaped every medieval household's daily routine. Wood needed to be gathered and split to feed the fire throughout the day and night. Water had to be carried from the well in quantities sufficient for all the day's needs while remaining fresh and clean for consumption. The ashes from the fire served their own purposes in Eleanor's household economy, providing the alkali needed for soap making and the nutrients that enriched her vegetable garden's soil. Nothing was wasted in a world where every resource required labor to obtain and careful management to preserve. As the morning progressed and the family prepared to scatter to their various labors, Eleanor reflected on the intricate choreography of fire and water that would govern her entire day. Every meal would require careful attention to timing and temperature. Every cleaning task would depend on hot water heated over the fire. Every moment of warmth and comfort would be made possible by the flames that she tended with the dedication of a guardian preserving something sacred. The cottage around her bore the marks of countless days spent in this same dance of fire and water. The blackened stones of the hearth, the water-stained wooden surfaces, the carefully arranged tools and implements that made possible the daily miracle of transforming raw materials into the cooked food, clean clothing, and warm shelter that sustained life in the medieval world. In the growing light of morning, surrounded by the evidence of her skill and dedication, Eleanor embodied the quiet mastery of medieval housewives who understood that survival depended not on convenience or technology, but on the patient cultivation of relationships with the elemental forces that shaped human life, finding in fire and water not just tools, but partners in the endless work of creating comfort and sustenance from the simplest materials that earth and human labor could provide. By mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to cast long shadows across the cottage floor, and the breakfast dishes lay clean and stacked on their wooden shelf, Eleanor's hands had already performed a dozen different tasks, and the day stretched ahead with countless more that would demand her constant attention, until darkness finally brought the possibility of rest. Her hands bore the permanent marks of her life's work, calluses from spinning and weaving, burns from cooking over open flames, cuts from garden work and food preparation, and the general roughness that came from contact with lye soap, hot water, and the countless abrasive materials that filled medieval daily life. These hands were tools as essential as any implement in her cottage, trained through years of practice to perform complex tasks with precision and efficiency. The spinning wheel that sat by the cottage's single window called to Eleanor with the silent persistence of work that could never be finished. Raw wool needed transformation into thread, thread needed weaving into cloth, and cloth needed sewing into the garments that clothed her family and provided trade goods for acquiring necessities that the household could not produce itself. Eleanor settled beside the spinning wheel with the same sense of returning to a familiar friend that marked her relationship with all the tools of her trade. The bundle of prepared wool, clean, carded, and ready for spinning, represented hours of previous work, but also the promise of eventual clothing that would keep her family warm through winter's cold embrace. Her hands found their rhythm on the spinning wheel with the automatic precision of movements performed thousands of times before. The wool flowed between her fingers, transforming under her touch from loose fiber into strong, even thread that would serve as the foundation for all her family's textile needs. This work required constant attention, but left her mind free to plan the day's other tasks and to find in the rhythmic motion a form of meditation that brought peace to the endless activity of medieval life. Young Mary sat beside her mother, learning to card wool with small wooden tools, made especially for her child-sized hands. Eleanor guided her daughter's movements with gentle corrections and patient instruction, understanding that these skills would determine the girl's ability to contribute to her future family's welfare. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter represented an unbroken chain of wisdom stretching back through generations of women who had survived through their mastery of essential domestic art. But the spinning wheel was only one of many claims on Eleanor's hands during the morning hours. The garden behind the cottage demanded daily attention as autumn vegetables approached their harvest time, and winter preparations required completion before frost could damage the crops that would sustain the family through the cold months ahead. Eleanor's hands moved through the garden with the sure knowledge of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that plants displayed when they needed water, nutrients, or protection from pests and diseases. The beans, hanging heavy on their vines, needed picking before they became too mature for eating fresh or too young for drying. The cabbages required careful inspection for the worms that could destroy a crop in days if not discovered and removed. The herb garden that provided medicines for her family's health received special attention from Eleanor's careful hands. Each plant required different treatment. Some thrived with regular watering, while others preferred drier conditions. Some needed protection from full sun, while others demanded maximum light for proper growth. This knowledge had been acquired through years of observation and experience, supplemented by wisdom passed down from her mother and the other women of the village who shared their understanding of plants and their uses. The chickens that provided eggs and occasional meat for the family table required their own form of care from Eleanor's busy hands. The wooden coop needed cleaning to prevent disease and maintain the healthy conditions that encouraged egg production. The birds themselves needed feeding with grain saved from the family's own harvest, their food carefully measured to provide adequate nutrition while conserving precious supplies for the long winter ahead. Eleanor's hands gathered the warm eggs with gentle care, understanding that these small treasures represented not just immediate nourishment, but also the possibility of future chickens if broody hens were allowed to hatch clutches during the spring months. Each egg was examined for cracks or other defects that might indicate problems with individual birds or issues with their housing and care. The cottage itself demanded constant attention from Eleanor's hands as she maintained the cleanliness and order that made family life pleasant and healthy. The stone floor required daily sweeping to remove the debris that accumulated from cooking, food preparation, and the general activities of family life. The wooden surfaces needed regular scrubbing, with lye soap and hot water to prevent the buildup of grease and food residue that could attract pests and create unpleasant odors. The beds required daily attention as Eleanor shook out the straw that served as mattresses, checking for dampness that could lead to rot, or signs of the insects that sometimes infested sleeping areas despite her best efforts at prevention. Woolen blankets needed airing and careful inspection for holes that required mending before they became large enough to compromise the bedding's ability to provide warmth. Eleanor's hands prepared the midday meal with the same attention to detail that marked all her domestic work. The vegetables from her garden were cleaned and chopped with a sharp knife that required careful handling and regular sharpening. The herbs that would flavor the stew were selected and measured by sight and experience, added to the cooking pot, in combinations that reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about flavors and nutrition. The bread that would accompany the meal required slicing with precision that prevented waste while ensuring that each family member received adequate nourishment. Eleanor's hands had learned to judge exactly how much bread each person needed based on their size, age, and the physical demands of their daily work. As the morning progressed toward midday, and the cottage filled with the sense of cooking food and domestic industry, Eleanor's hands continued their endless round of activity. Clothes needed mending where seams had split or fabric had worn thin. Tools required maintenance to keep them sharp and effective. Supplies needed organizing and inventory to ensure that nothing essential would be lacking when winter's isolation made trips to market difficult or impossible. The water bucket by the door needed refilling from the village well, a task that would exercise Eleanor's arms and back as she carried the heavy vessel across the common ground where the community's water source was carefully maintained and protected. This water would serve a dozen purposes throughout the day: cooking, cleaning, drinking, and the countless small uses that made civilized life possible. In the cottage's warm interior, surrounded by the evidence of her constant labor and the tools that made her work possible, Eleanor embodied the quiet efficiency of medieval housewives whose hands never truly rested from dawn until darkness finally brought the possibility of sleep. Her hands were instruments of survival and comfort, trained through necessity to perform the countless tasks that transformed raw materials into the clothing, food, and shelter that sustained her family through all the seasons of medieval life. Each movement of her hands reflected accumulated wisdom about the most efficient ways to accomplish essential tasks, the proper techniques for working with different materials, and the patient persistence required to maintain a household without the conveniences that would not exist for centuries to come. In her hands lay the power to create comfort from hardship, abundance from scarcity, and beauty from the simplest materials that medieval life provided. As the midday sun reached its peak and cast the shortest shadows of the day, Eleanor made her way to the garden plot behind her cottage, where the earth held the results of months of patient labor and the promise of sustenance that would carry her family through the approaching winter. The garden represented more than mere food production. It embodied her deep knowledge of plants and seasons, her understanding of the soil's needs, and her ability to coax abundance from the small patch of ground that supplemented her family's survival. The autumn garden displayed the fruits of Eleanor's spring planning and summer tending in neat rows of vegetables that had been carefully selected for their ability to provide both immediate nourishment and long-term storage. Cabbages sat heavy and firm in their furrows, their outer leaves showing the first touches of frost that would soon transform the garden's green abundance into the dormant brown of winter's approach. Eleanor moved through the garden rows with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that plants displayed when they needed attention. The bean vines, heavy with pods, required daily picking to ensure that the legumes remained tender for immediate consumption, while allowing some to mature fully for winter storage. Her hands worked with gentle efficiency, selecting beans at the perfect stage of ripeness while leaving others to continue their development. The herb section of Eleanor's garden demanded its own specialized attention as she gathered the medicinal plants that would serve her family's health needs throughout the coming months. Sage and thyme, carefully dried and stored, would provide remedies for winter colds and coughs. Mint would soothe upset stomachs and add flavor to the simple meals that marked peasant dining. Chamomile would offer comfort for sleepless nights and nervous tensions. Each herb required different treatment for optimal preservation of its healing properties. Eleanor knew exactly when each plant reached its peak potency, which parts contained the most beneficial compounds, and how to dry and store each variety to maintain maximum effectiveness through months of storage. This knowledge had been passed down from her mother and grandmother, supplemented by her own years of observation and experimentation. The onions and garlic that would flavor winter meals throughout the cold months needed careful harvesting before frost could damage their storage. Qualities: Eleanor pulled each bulb with attention to its condition, selecting the largest and most perfect specimens for winter keeping, while setting aside those that showed any signs of damage for immediate consumption. The soil beneath Eleanor's feet told its own story of careful stewardship and understanding of the earth's needs. She had learned from her mother how to read the subtle signs that indicated soil health, the color and texture that spoke of adequate nutrition, the presence of earthworms that indicated proper drainage and organic content, and the way water, absorbed or pooled, that revealed whether amendments were needed. The compost pile at the garden's edge received daily additions of kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, and other organic matter that would decompose over winter to provide rich nutrients for next year's growing season. Eleanor understood the cycle that connected today's waste to tomorrow's abundance, the patient process that transformed scraps and debris into the fertile soil that made abundant harvests possible. Young Mary worked beside her mother, learning to distinguish between ripe and unripe vegetables, between plants that needed water and those that preferred drier conditions, between beneficial insects that should be protected and harmful pests that required removal. The girl's education in garden management would prove essential when she eventually managed her own household and needed to provide food for her own family. The watering of the garden required its own form of strategic thinking, as Eleanor conserved precious water while ensuring that each plant received adequate moisture for healthy growth. Water had to be carried from the village well in wooden buckets, making every drop valuable and requiring careful planning to provide irrigation without waste. Eleanor's knowledge of companion planting had been acquired through generations of women who discovered which plants grew well together and which combinations provided mutual benefits. Beans climbed poles that also supported squash vines, creating efficient use of garden space while allowing both plants to thrive. Herbs planted among vegetables provided natural pest control while making maximum use of available ground. The harvest that Eleanor gathered each day from her garden required immediate processing to prevent spoilage and ensure maximum nutrition for her family. Vegetables needed cleaning, trimming, and preparation for cooking or storage. Some could be eaten fresh, while others required preservation through drying, fermentation, or storage in root cellars that maintained proper temperature and humidity for long-term keeping. The tools that Eleanor used in her garden work reflected the medieval understanding that good implements properly maintained could last for years and make work more efficient and enjoyable. Her wooden hoe had been shaped by William's patient carving to fit her hands and height perfectly. The baskets that held her harvest were woven from willow branches that she had gathered herself and prepared according to techniques learned from village women skilled in basketry. The garden's productivity depended not only on Eleanor's daily attention, but also on her understanding of the seasonal rhythms that governed plant growth and development. She knew exactly when to plant each variety for optimal growth, when to harvest for best flavor and nutrition, and when to save seeds for the following year's planting. The seeds that Eleanor saved from her finest plants represented investment in future harvests and the continuation of varieties that had been selected for their adaptation to local conditions. These seeds, carefully dried and stored in pottery containers, carried genetic memories of successful growth and would provide the foundation for next year's garden productivity. As the afternoon sun moved across the sky and cast longer shadows, through the garden rows, Eleanor reflected on the deep satisfaction that came from this daily communion with the earth and growing things. The garden provided not just food for her family's table, but also connection to the natural rhythms that governed all life, understanding of the cycles that connected seed to harvest to seed again in endless renewal. The knowledge that guided Eleanor's garden work represented one of humanity's oldest accomplishments, the ability to work with natural processes to increase the Earth's productivity while maintaining the health and fertility that would sustain future generations. In her hands lay the wisdom of countless women who had learned to read the soil's needs, to understand the subtle requirements of different plants, and to coax abundance from small plots of ground through patient attention and accumulated knowledge. Mist, Garden's daily demands were never finished, but always rewarding, requiring constant attention, while providing the deep satisfaction that comes from work that directly sustains life and connects human effort to the eternal cycles of growth, harvest, and renewal that govern all living things. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its daily zenith and the urgent call of harvest echoed across the fields that surrounded their village, Eleanor faced the familiar challenge that defined medieval women's lives: the need to balance her household responsibilities with the agricultural work that their feudal obligations demanded. The lord's fields required every available hand during harvest time, and Eleanor's labor was as essential as her husband's for gathering the grain that would feed the community through winter's lean months. Eleanor secured the cottage as best she could, banking the fire to maintain warmth while ensuring it would not pose a danger during her absence. The younger children would accompany her to the fields where they could help with simple tasks while remaining under her watchful supervision. Young Thomas, at 8 years old, was already skilled enough to assist with gleaning and other age-appropriate field work. The walk to the harvest fields took Eleanor and her children across the common lands where the village's sheep grazed, and down paths worn smooth by generations of peasants who had made this same journey during countless harvest seasons. Eleanor carried with her the tools she would need for field work: a sharp sickle for cutting grain, a wooden rake for gathering sheaves, and baskets for collecting the grain that would be separated from the stalks. The harvest field stretched before Eleanor like a golden sea, heavy with grain that had ripened under summer's patient sun and now demanded immediate attention before autumn rains could damage the precious crop. The sight of so much abundance created feelings both of gratitude for nature's generosity and anxiety about the enormous amount of work required to gather and process the harvest before weather conditions could destroy months of careful cultivation. Eleanor joined the long line of workers who moved across the field with rhythmic precision, their sickles cutting through grain stalks in movements that had been perfected through centuries of agricultural practice. The work required strength, endurance, and skill, as Eleanor bent repeatedly to cut grain close to the ground while maintaining the pace that kept the harvest line moving efficiently across the field. The physical demands of harvest work tested Eleanor's strength in ways that her household labors did not. Hours of bending and cutting under the autumn sun created aches in muscles that had been conditioned by different types of activity. Her hands, already hardened by daily domestic work, developed new calluses from gripping the sickle's wooden handle and wielding it with the force needed to cut through tough grain stalks. Young Mary stayed close to her mother, learning through observation and gentle guidance how to gather the cut grain into neat sheaves that could be efficiently transported to the threshing area. The girl's small hands were well suited to the detailed work of organizing grain stalks and binding them with twisted straw into bundles that would not fall apart during handling. Little Anne, too young for active field work, played contentedly in the shade at the field's edge while Eleanor worked within sight and calling distance. Medieval children learned early to adapt to their parents' work schedules, finding entertainment in simple games while understanding that harvest time required adult attention to focus on gathering the grain that would sustain the community through winter months. The social aspect of harvest work provided welcome relief from the isolation that often marked Eleanor's daily domestic routines. Working alongside other village women created opportunities for conversation, shared knowledge, and the community support that made difficult physical labor more bearable. The women sang traditional songs that helped maintain working rhythm while sharing news and information about family activities, village events, and seasonal concerns. Eleanor's knowledge of grain varieties and their optimal harvest timing proved valuable as she identified stalks that had reached perfect ripeness, while noting others that needed additional time to mature fully. This understanding, acquired through years of agricultural experience, helped maximize the harvest's quantity and quality while preventing waste of precious food resources. The gleaning that followed the main harvest provided opportunities for Eleanor and other village women to gather grain that had been missed during the initial cutting. This grain, though smaller in quantity than the Lord's portion, belonged to the workers and represented important additions to family food supplies. Eleanor moved through the cut fields with practiced efficiency, spotting overlooked grain stalks and fallen kernels that could supplement her family's winter provisions. The children proved particularly useful during gleaning, their sharp eyes and small stature allowing them to spot grain that adults might miss, while their enthusiasm for the treasure hunt aspect of the work made them eager contributors to the family's food-gathering efforts. Thomas and Mary competed good-naturedly to see who could find the most overlooked grain, turning necessary work into an engaging game. The transportation of harvested grain from field to storage areas required coordination among all workers, as heavy bundles needed lifting and carrying across uneven ground to locations where threshing and winnowing could separate grain kernels from stalks and chaff. Eleanor's strength, developed through years of carrying water, lifting children, and managing household tasks, proved valuable for this demanding physical work. The satisfaction that Eleanor felt as the day's harvest work concluded reflected not just relief at the completion of difficult physical labor, but also deep appreciation for her contribution to the community's survival and her family's welfare. The grain she had helped to harvest would be processed into flour that would become bread for winter meals, providing essential nutrition during months when fresh food was scarce and expensive. As evening approached and the harvest workers began their journey back to the village, Eleanor carried with her aching muscles and tired hands, but also the knowledge that she had fulfilled essential obligations while adding to her family's winter food security. The dual demands of household management and agricultural work that marked medieval women's lives had been met for another day. The cottage that welcomed Eleanor's return held the same domestic tasks that had been waiting when she left for the fields, but now they seemed less burdensome because of the contrast with the day's demanding outdoor labor. The fire needed rebuilding, the evening meal required preparation, and the children needed care, but these familiar tasks felt like returning to comfortable routine after the physically challenging work of harvest. In the growing twilight, as Eleanor resumed her household duties, while her body still ached from the day's field work, she embodied the remarkable adaptability of medieval women who balanced multiple roles and responsibilities without the conveniences that would not exist for centuries to come. Her day reflected the complex reality of peasant women's lives, where domestic mastery and agricultural contribution combined to create the foundation for family and community survival. Let yourself rest now in the understanding that human beings have always found ways to balance competing demands and multiple responsibilities, that the women who came before us managed extraordinary challenges with grace and determination, and that the strength to meet each day's demands comes not from avoiding difficulty, but from developing the skills and resilience that transform challenge into opportunity, for demonstrating the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to adapt, endure, and thrive through the patient cultivation of wisdom, strength, and the quiet heroism that marks ordinary lives lived with extraordinary dedication. As autumn evening settled over the cottage and the family gathered around the hearth after their return from the harvest fields, Eleanor took up the work that would occupy many of her evening hours throughout the coming winter, the endless task of spinning raw wool into the thread that would become her family's clothing, bedding, and trade goods. The spinning wheel stood ready beside her chair, its smooth wooden surfaces polished by years of use, and its mechanisms maintained with the careful attention that essential tools required. The basket of prepared wool at Eleanor's feet represented hours of previous work, fleece that had been sheared from their own sheep, carefully washed to remove lanolin and debris, combed and carded to align the fibers, and prepared in neat bundles ready for transformation into thread. Each step in this process had required skill and patience, but the spinning itself demanded a different kind of expertise that combined physical coordination with mental concentration. Eleanor settled into the rhythm of spinning with the automatic, precision of movements performed thousands of times before. Her hands guided the wool fibers as the wheel turned, drawing out the raw material into increasingly fine strands, while the spindle twisted individual fibers into strong, even thread. The work required constant attention to tension and speed, ensuring that the thread formed consistently without breaking or developing thick and thin spots that would create problems during weaving. Young Mary sat beside her mother, practicing with her own small spindle as she learned the skills that would prove essential for her future household management. Eleanor guided her daughter's movements with gentle corrections and patient instruction, understanding that spinning ability would determine the girl's capacity to provide clothing for her own family and to contribute valuable trade goods to the household economy. The social aspect of evening spinning had been a constant in Eleanor's life since childhood, when she had sat beside her own mother while learning the intricate skills that transformed fleece into fabric. The repetitive motion of spinning left the mind free for conversation, storytelling, and the sharing of knowledge that strengthened family bonds while productive work continued. William sat nearby, carving wooden implements and tools, while Eleanor spun, their combined evening labor representing the partnership that sustained medieval households through the cooperation of different but complementary skills. The children played quiet games by the fire's light, learning through observation the work patterns that would shape their own adult lives. The thread that grew on Eleanor's spindle would serve multiple purposes in her household economy. The finest thread would be reserved for undergarments and baby clothes that needed to be soft against sensitive skin. Stronger thread would become outer garments that needed durability for daily wear and work activities. The coarsest thread would be used for utility items like bags, ropes, and other household necessities. Eleanor's knowledge of wool qualities allowed her to select appropriate fleece for different purposes, understanding which sheep produced the finest wool for luxury items and which provided the stronger fibers needed for work clothing. This discrimination had been learned through years of experience with different wool types and their behavior during spinning and weaving. The physical demands of spinning required strength and endurance that complemented the different muscle groups used during Eleanor's daytime activities. Hours of guiding the spinning wheel exercised her arms and back while requiring the hand-eye coordination that maintained consistent thread quality. The work was less strenuous than field labor, but demanded sustained concentration that could be mentally exhausting after long days of household management and agricultural work. The spinning wheel itself represented a significant investment in Eleanor's household equipment, its wooden frame and metal components carefully crafted by skilled artisans and maintained through regular cleaning and adjustment. Eleanor understood the mechanics of her wheel intimately, knowing how to adjust tension, replace worn parts, and troubleshoot the problems that could interrupt her work. The seasonal rhythm of spinning followed the agricultural calendar, with intensive wool preparation occurring after spring shearing and long evening spinning sessions filling the autumn and winter months when outdoor work was limited. Eleanor planned her spinning schedule to ensure adequate thread supplies for her family's clothing needs, while producing enough surplus to trade for goods that the household could not manufacture itself. The quality of Eleanor's thread reflected Not only her technical skill, but also her understanding of how different thread weights and textures would perform during weaving and garment construction. Thread that was too loosely spun would lack strength for durable clothing, while overly tight spinning could create fabric that was stiff and uncomfortable to wear. The color of Eleanor's thread depended on the natural wool shades available from her sheep and the vegetable dyes that she could prepare from plants gathered in the countryside or purchased from traveling merchants. The subtle variations in natural wool colors, from cream to brown to gray, provided variety in finished garments, while the limited palette of available dyes created clothing that reflected the natural world's muted tones. Eleanor's spinning techniques had been passed down through generations of women in her family, each adding their own refinements and improvements to methods that had proven successful over centuries of textile production. The knowledge included not only the mechanics of operating a spinning wheel, but also the subtle understanding of how different wools behaved and what techniques produced the best results with various fiber types. The thread that Eleanor produced would eventually travel to her loom, where it would be woven into cloth that could be made into garments for her family or traded for necessities that the household could not produce. The transformation from fleece to fabric to finished clothing represented a complete production cycle that began and ended within the domestic sphere that Eleanor managed. The evening hours spent spinning provided time for reflection and planning. As Eleanor's hands worked automatically while her mind ranged over the next day's tasks, the seasonal preparations that required attention, and the longer-term planning that ensured her family's welfare through all the cycles of medieval life. The soft whisper of the spinning wheel and the gentle crackling of the fire created a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted with the day's more demanding activities. Eleanor found in this evening work a form of meditation that brought calm to bodies and minds that had been stressed by the physical and mental demands of managing a medieval household. The thread that accumulated on her spindle represented more than mere raw material for clothing production. It embodied Eleanor's skill, patience, and dedication to providing for her family's needs through her own labor. Each strand contained hours of work and generations of accumulated knowledge about the textile arts that clothed medieval Europe. As the evening progressed and the cottage filled with the quiet sounds of productive family activity, Eleanor continued the spinning that would occupy many winter evenings to come. The work connected her to countless other women across the medieval world who sat beside their own fires, transforming wool into thread while maintaining the textile production that clothed their families and communities. The spinning wheel would continue to turn throughout the long winter months ahead, producing thread that would become the fabric of her family's daily life while providing the trade goods that supplemented their household economy. In the gentle rhythm of spinning, Eleanor found not just productive work, but also connection to the eternal cycles of production and consumption that sustained human communities through the patient transformation of raw materials into the necessities of civilized life. The endless wheel of spinning represented both the repetitive nature of medieval domestic work and the endless creativity that found ways to transform simple materials into complex products that served human needs for protection, comfort, and beauty. In Eleanor's hands, raw wool became the foundation for clothing that would protect her family through winter's cold while expressing the subtle artistry that made even utilitarian objects beautiful through skilled craftsmanship and patient attention to detail. When little Anne woke in the deep of night with the burning fever and labored breathing that struck terror into every medieval parent's heart, Eleanor's role transformed from household manager to family healer, drawing upon generations of accumulated knowledge about herbs, remedies, and the art of nursing that had been passed down through countless mothers who had faced the same frightening challenges without access to physicians or modern medicine. Eleanor's hands, already skilled in a dozen domestic arts, now became instruments of healing as she felt her daughter's forehead and recognized the signs of the respiratory illness that could prove fatal to young children if not treated with immediate attention and skilled care. The fever that burned beneath Anne's skin spoke of a battle raging within the small body, a fight that would require all of Eleanor's knowledge and constant vigilance to help her daughter's natural defenses overcome the illness. The chest, where Eleanor stored her medicinal herbs, held the accumulated pharmacy of a medieval housewife who understood that survival often depended on the ability to treat illness with remedies prepared from plants that grew in fields and gardens. Each dried herb had been gathered at the optimal time for maximum potency, carefully preserved through proper drying techniques, and stored in conditions that maintained their healing properties through months of storage. Eleanor's knowledge of herbal medicine had been acquired through the traditional education that passed from mother to daughter, supplemented by observation of what treatments proved effective and which remedies failed to provide relief. This practical understanding of plant medicine represented one of humanity's oldest healing traditions, refined through countless generations of women who served as their family's primary healthcare providers. The preparation of Anne's medicine began with chamomile flowers steeped in hot water to create a tea that would soothe the child's inflamed throat and provide gentle sedative properties to encourage healing rest. Eleanor's hands moved with practiced precision as she measured herbs by sight and experience, understanding exactly how much plant material would provide therapeutic benefit without creating dangerous concentrations of active compounds. Willow bark, carefully scraped and prepared, would provide pain relief and fever reduction through compounds that modern medicine would later identify and synthesize. Eleanor understood through traditional knowledge that willow bark eased suffering and reduced fever, though she lacked the scientific explanation for these effects that would not be discovered for centuries to come. The steam tent that Eleanor created around Anne's bed used techniques passed down through generations of mothers who had learned to combat respiratory illness with warm, moist air that helped open congested airways and ease the breathing difficulties that could prove fatal to young children. Hot water in pottery vessels released steam into an enclosed space created with carefully arranged blankets and cloth. Eleanor's vigil beside her daughter's bed reflected the complete dedication that medieval mothers brought to nursing sick children, understanding that survival often depended on constant attention and the willingness to sacrifice sleep, food, and personal comfort to provide the care that might make the difference between recovery and loss. Young Thomas and Mary understood, instinctively, that their mother's attention needed to focus completely on their sister's illness, and they took on additional household responsibilities without being asked. Thomas fed the chickens and gathered eggs while Mary helped prepare simple meals that required minimal attention from Eleanor's worried concentration. William carved additional wooden spoons and bowls during the long evening hours while Eleanor nursed their daughter, his hands finding comfort in productive work while his heart carried the same fears that filled his wife's worried mind. Medieval families faced illness together, sharing both the practical burdens of care and the emotional weight of uncertainty about outcomes that remained beyond human control. The herbal preparations that Eleanor used to treat Anne's illness represented sophisticated understanding of plant medicine that had been developed through empirical observation and traditional knowledge. Horehound for respiratory congestion, elderflower for fever reduction, and honey to soothe irritated throats created a comprehensive treatment approach that addressed multiple aspects of the illness. Eleanor's knowledge included not only which herbs to use, but also how to prepare them for maximum effectiveness, when to administer different remedies, and how to recognize the signs that indicated improvement or worsening of the patient's condition. This diagnostic ability had been learned through experience with previous illnesses and instruction from older women who had successfully nursed families through various health crises. The practical aspects of nursing a seriously ill child required constant attention to details that could affect recovery, and needed frequent small sips of liquid to prevent dangerous dehydration, but too much fluid at once could cause vomiting that would worsen her condition. The balance between providing adequate nutrition and avoiding digestive upset required careful observation and constant adjustment of feeding schedules. Eleanor's hands provided comfort through gentle massage that helped relieve muscle aches and promoted circulation, while also serving as a diagnostic tool that detected changes in body temperature, breathing patterns, and the subtle signs that indicated whether the illness was progressing toward recovery or worsening toward crisis. The sleepless nights that Eleanor spent monitoring Anne's condition tested her physical endurance while demanding mental alertness that could recognize emergency situations requiring immediate intervention. Medieval mothers learned to function on minimal sleep while maintaining the concentration needed to provide effective nursing care throughout illnesses that might last for days or weeks. The community support that surrounded Eleanor's family during Anne's illness reflected the understanding that medical crises affected entire communities, and that survival often depended on shared knowledge and mutual assistance. Neighboring women offered advice based on their own experiences, contributed herbs from their own medical stores, and provided practical help with household tasks that allowed Eleanor to focus completely on nursing. The prayers that accompanied Eleanor's medical care reflected the medieval understanding that healing required both human effort and divine intervention, that practical remedies needed to be supplemented with spiritual support that addressed the aspects of illness that lay beyond human control or understanding. As Anne's fever began to break after 3 days of intensive nursing and the child's breathing became easier and more regular, Eleanor felt the profound relief that came with successful treatment of serious illness. The crisis had passed through a combination of skilled care, appropriate remedies, and the child's own natural resilience that had overcome the illness's challenges. The recovery period that followed Anne's fever required continued attention as Eleanor helped her daughter regain strength while preventing complications that could undo the progress that had been achieved. Gentle foods, continued herbal teas, and gradual return to normal activities ensured that healing continued without setbacks that could cause renewed illness. Eleanor's success in nursing Anne through serious illness added to her reputation within the community as a skilled healer whose knowledge and dedication could be trusted in medical crises. This recognition would lead to requests for assistance from other families facing similar challenges, adding another dimension to Eleanor's already extensive responsibilities. In the gentle morning light that marked Anne's return to health, Eleanor reflected on the profound satisfaction that came from successfully meeting one of motherhood's greatest challenges while drawing upon knowledge and skills that connected her to countless generations of women who had faced the same fears and responsibilities, with courage, wisdom, and the kind of love that expresses itself through dedicated care during times of crisis. As autumn deepened and the final harvest demanded every available hand to gather crops before winter's arrival could destroy months of careful cultivation, Eleanor faced the exhausting reality that medieval women lived, the need to simultaneously maintain household responsibilities while contributing essential labor to the agricultural work that sustained entire communities through the cold months ahead. The dawn that called Eleanor to the harvest fields came earlier each day as shortening daylight hours compressed the time available for gathering crops that could not wait for more convenient scheduling. Eleanor prepared her family for another day of intensive field work while ensuring that essential household tasks received enough attention to prevent problems that could create additional hardships during an already demanding season. The harvest required every family member who was capable of useful work, from William's skilled scythe handling to young Thomas's eager assistance with gleaning and Mary's careful bundling of grain stalks into manageable sheaves. Even little Anne, now recovered from her recent illness, could contribute by gathering fallen grain kernels and helping to organize harvested materials for efficient transportation to storage areas. Eleanor's hands, already hardened by daily domestic work, developed new calluses and aches as she wielded harvesting tools that demanded different muscles and movements than her household tasks required. The repetitive motion of cutting grain stalks with a sharp sickle created strains in her back and arms that reminded her each evening of the day's intensive physical labor. The pace of harvest work allowed no accommodation for the fatigue that accumulated through days of dawn to dusk field labor, combined with abbreviated household maintenance that still required attention during early morning and evening hours. Eleanor learned to function on minimal sleep while maintaining the concentration needed for safe tool handling and efficient work that kept pace with the community's collective efforts. The organization of harvest work required sophisticated coordination among all community members as different fields reached readiness at various times, and weather conditions created opportunities that had to be seized immediately or lost to rain, wind, or frost that could destroy ripe crops in hours. Eleanor's participation in this collective effort reflected the understanding that individual family survival depended on community success. The social aspects of harvest work provided some relief from the physical demands as Eleanor worked alongside other village women who shared the same challenges and understood the pressures that came with balancing agricultural obligations and household responsibilities. Conversations during brief rest periods allowed sharing of knowledge about efficient work techniques and strategies for managing competing demands on time and energy. Eleanor's knowledge of grain varieties and their optimal harvest timing proved valuable as she identified crops that had reached perfect ripeness while recognizing others that needed additional time to mature fully. This understanding, developed through years of agricultural experience, helped maximize both quantity and quality of the harvest while preventing waste of precious food resources. The gleaning that followed the main harvest provided opportunities for Eleanor to gather grain that belonged to the workers rather than the Lord, but this additional food came at the cost of extra hours spent in fields where she had already worked throughout the day. The grain collected through gleaning would supplement her family's winter food supplies, making the additional effort worthwhile despite her exhaustion. The children's participation in harvest work served multiple purposes as they contributed useful labor while learning skills that would prove essential in their adult lives. Thomas gained experience with agricultural tools and techniques that would serve him well when he eventually managed his own farming responsibilities. Mary learned to recognize grain quality and proper harvesting timing that would inform her future household management decisions. The processing of harvested grain required immediate attention to prevent spoilage and ensure maximum food value from the crops that had been gathered with such intensive effort. Eleanor worked late into harvest evenings, cleaning grain, preparing some for immediate consumption, and organizing the rest for storage in conditions that would preserve it through winter's long months. The physical toll of harvest work accumulated in Eleanor's body as aching muscles and strained joints reminded her of the demanding nature of agricultural labor that required strength, endurance, and pain tolerance that tested the limits of human capability. Medieval women developed remarkable physical resilience through necessity, but even that strength had limits that harvest season sometimes exceeded. The weather conditions during harvest created additional challenges as Eleanor worked under sun, that could be blazingly hot, or rain that made fields muddy and treacherous while threatening to damage ripe crops. The urgency of gathering grain before weather could destroy it meant that work continued regardless of personal comfort or preference for more pleasant conditions. The tools that Eleanor used for harvest work required maintenance and care that added to her daily responsibilities, as dull blades made work harder and more dangerous, while broken handles could create injuries that would interfere with essential labor. She learned to sharpen sickles, repair damaged tools, and maintain equipment that had to function reliably under demanding conditions. The meals that sustained harvest workers required preparation, despite Eleanor's exhaustion from field work and her limited time for food preparation. Simple, nourishing food had to be ready when hungry workers returned from the fields, demanding efficient meal planning and preparation techniques that provided adequate nutrition without requiring excessive time or complex cooking methods. The satisfaction that came with successful completion of harvest work balanced the exhaustion and physical discomfort, as Eleanor saw the results of intensive labor transformed into stored grain that would sustain her family through winter months, when fresh food would be scarce and expensive. The aches in her body represented investment in her family's survival and security. The community celebration that marked harvest completion provided recognition for the collective effort that had gathered crops essential for community survival, while acknowledging the individual contributions that made success possible. Eleanor's participation in these celebrations reflected her status as an essential contributor to community welfare and agricultural success. As harvest season concluded, and Eleanor returned to the more manageable routines of regular household work, she carried with her the satisfaction of having met one of medieval life's greatest challenges while contributing essential labor to community survival. The exhaustion that marked harvest's end would gradually fade, but the knowledge that she had successfully balanced competing demands while maintaining her family's welfare would remain as evidence of her remarkable capabilities. In the gentle relief that followed harvest completion, Eleanor embodied the extraordinary resilience of medieval women who managed multiple roles and responsibilities while contributing essential labor to community survival, demonstrating the human capacity to meet extraordinary demands through determination, skill, and the understanding that individual welfare depended on collective success achieved through shared effort and mutual support. As the first snows of winter dusted the cottage roof and sealed the family into the months-long intimacy of indoor living, Eleanor's domain transformed from the expansive outdoor work of harvest season to the concentrated intensity of winter's indoor kingdom, where every square foot of the cottage became a workshop and every hour of daylight held precious opportunities for the textile work that would clothe her family and provide trade goods for spring markets. The cottage that had seemed spacious during summer months, when much of family life occurred outdoors, now became the entire universe for Eleanor's winter work, as freezing temperatures and shortened daylight hours concentrated all productive activity within the walls that provided protection from weather. That could be deadly for those caught unprepared by winter's harsh demands. Eleanor's loom moved close to the cottage's single window to catch maximum light during winter's brief days, became the centerpiece of her indoor kingdom as she transformed the thread she had spun during autumn evenings into the cloth that would serve her family's needs and provide valuable trade goods. The steady rhythm of weaving created its own form of meditation, while producing fabric that represented security and accomplishment. The weaving process required intense concentration, as Eleanor maintained proper tension on countless individual threads while creating patterns that combined function with beauty. Each passage of the shuttle through the warp created another line of fabric, but mistakes in tension or pattern could create flaws that would weaken the finished cloth or make it unsuitable for its intended purpose. Young Mary worked beside her mother, learning the complex skills of textile production through observation and carefully supervised practice. The girl's nimble fingers proved well suited to the detailed work of preparing thread, maintaining loom equipment, and assisting with the intricate process of creating cloth from individual fibers. The cottage's interior became a carefully organized workspace as Eleanor arranged her tools and materials for maximum efficiency during the long winter months when every hour of daylight needed to be used productively. Baskets of prepared wool, spools of finished thread, and partially completed textile projects filled every available space while remaining organized enough to support efficient work. The fire that provided heat for the cottage also served Eleanor's textile work as she used its warmth to dry freshly dyed yarns and to create the steamy conditions needed for setting colors and finishing fabrics. The management of fire for both heating and textile production required careful attention to prevent damage to delicate materials while maintaining the warmth needed for comfortable living and working. Eleanor's knowledge of natural dyes allowed her to create cloth in colors that provided variety and beauty while working within the limitations of materials available to medieval households. Madder root for red, woad for blue, and various plant materials for yellow and brown created a palette that reflected the natural world while providing attractive options for family clothing and trade goods. The preparation of wool for winter. Weaving required completion of processes that had been started during autumn's busy harvest season. Raw fleece needed final cleaning, combing, and preparation before it could be spun into thread, while thread needed to be prepared and organized for efficient weaving that would maximize production during winter's limited daylight hours. The sewing and mending that accompanied Eleanor's weaving work addressed the constant need for clothing maintenance and creation that kept her family properly dressed despite the hard wear that medieval garments received. Every piece of clothing required regular attention to prevent minor problems from becoming major issues that could make garments unwearable. Eleanor's skill in garment construction allowed her to create clothing that fit her family members properly, while using fabric efficiently to prevent waste of precious materials. The cutting and sewing of garments required understanding of how fabric behaved, how human bodies moved, and how to create comfortable, durable clothing from limited amounts of cloth. The cottage's cramped quarters during winter months required careful management of space and activities as Eleanor balanced textile work with the cooking, cleaning, and childcare that continued regardless of seasonal limitations. The ability to shift quickly between different types of work while maintaining productivity in all areas reflected the sophisticated time management skills that medieval women developed through necessity. The long winter evenings provided extended time for Eleanor's textile work as the family gathered around the fire for warmth while remaining productively occupied with tasks that contributed to household welfare. These evening hours allowed completion of complex projects that required sustained attention and the careful work that could not be rushed. The children's winter education continued through their participation in textile work, as Thomas learned to prepare wool and maintain equipment, while Mary advanced her skills in spinning and weaving. Even little Anne could contribute through simple tasks that developed her coordination while teaching her the basics of textile production that would serve her throughout her life. The social aspects of winter textile work provided relief from the isolation that could characterize medieval winter life, as Eleanor occasionally joined other village women for communal work sessions that combined productivity with the companionship that helped maintain spirits during the challenging winter months. The trade goods that Eleanor produced during winter months represented important additions to her family's economic resources, as surplus cloth could be exchanged for materials and supplies that the household could not produce itself. The The quality of her textile work directly affected the value of these trade goods and their usefulness in acquiring necessities. Eleanor's winter kingdom required constant heating as the fire needed feeding throughout the day and careful banking during night hours to prevent the cottage from becoming dangerously cold. The management of fuel supplies and heating efficiency affected both family comfort and the ability to maintain productive work schedules during winter's harsh months. The completion of major textile projects during winter months provided Eleanor with the satisfaction that came from transforming raw materials into finished goods through patient skill and sustained effort. Each piece of completed cloth represented hours of work and the application of knowledge that had been acquired through years of experience and instruction. As winter deepened and Eleanor's indoor kingdom reached full productivity, the cottage became a testament to the remarkable efficiency of medieval households that transformed limited space and resources into productive workshops capable of meeting family needs while creating surplus goods for trade and exchange. The steady rhythm of Eleanor's winter work created its own seasonal music as the sounds of spinning, weaving and sewing filled the cottage with evidence of productive activity that transformed the enforced isolation of winter into an opportunity for concentrated accomplishment and skill development that would serve the family throughout the coming year. In her winter kingdom, Eleanor demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of medieval women who transformed seasonal limitations into opportunities for productivity, creating from the constraints of winter weather and shortened daylight hours a concentrated period of textile production that clothed families and communities while providing the trade goods that supplemented agricultural income with the fruits of skilled domestic labor. As spring's gentle warmth began to penetrate the cottage walls and the first crocuses pushed through the snow outside Eleanor's door, the eternal cycle that governed medieval women's lives prepared to begin anew, carrying with it all the accumulated wisdom of another year spent mastering the countless skills that sustained families and communities through the patient application of knowledge passed down through generations of women who had faced the same challenges with courage, creativity, and the quiet heroism of daily survival. Eleanor stood in her cottage doorway, looking out at the garden plot where new life stirred beneath winter's retreating blanket, and felt the familiar stirring of anticipation that marked the transition from winter's intensive indoor work to spring's expanding opportunities for outdoor activity. The rhythm that had governed her life for another complete cycle prepared to repeat itself with the reliability of seasons and the endless demands of human survival in a world where comfort and security could only be achieved through constant effort and accumulated skill. The loom that had occupied the cottage's prime position during winter months would soon be moved aside to make room for the expanded activities that spring would bring. The cloth that Eleanor had woven during winter's long evenings represented not just fabric for her family's use, but also trade goods that would provide resources for acquiring materials and supplies that her household could not produce independently. The children who had spent winter months learning textile skills and household management would soon return to outdoor activities that included garden work, animal care, and the agricultural tasks that supported family survival while providing education in the skills that would serve them throughout their adult lives. The knowledge they had gained during winter's concentrated indoor instruction would be supplemented by spring's practical application of learned skills. The cottage that had served as Eleanor's winter kingdom would once again expand to include the outdoor spaces where much of medieval life occurred during warmer months. The garden would require preparation for another year's planting. The animals would need attention after winter's confinement, and the endless cycle of food production, preservation, and consumption would begin anew. Eleanor's hands, which had been focused on textile work during winter months would soon return to the diverse tasks that filled her spring and summer days. Garden preparation, cooking with fresh ingredients, childcare that included outdoor supervision, and the countless domestic tasks that required attention, regardless of season, would once again fill her days with varied activities. The knowledge that Eleanor had accumulated through another year of household management included not only technical skills, but also deeper understanding of the rhythms that governed medieval life and the strategies that made survival possible within the constraints that natural forces and social obligations imposed on peasant families. The community relationships that had sustained Eleanor's family through winter's challenges would continue to provide mutual support and shared knowledge as spring brought renewed opportunities for cooperation and assistance. The network of women who shared domestic wisdom, men who collaborated on agricultural tasks, and children who learned together would continue to strengthen the bonds that made individual survival dependent on community welfare. The seasonal preparations that Eleanor would undertake during spring months reflected accumulated understanding of how to anticipate future needs while addressing immediate demands. Seed selection for the garden, planning for food preservation, and organization of household resources required forward thinking that connected present activities to future security and comfort. The tools and equipment that had served Eleanor through another year of domestic work would require maintenance and replacement as needed to ensure continued productivity and efficiency. The investment in quality implements and their careful maintenance reflected understanding that good tools, properly cared for, could serve families for years while making work more efficient and enjoyable. Eleanor's role as teacher and knowledge keeper would continue as she passed on to her children the skills and understanding that would enable them to manage their own households and contribute to community welfare. The education that occurred through daily participation in domestic activities provided practical training that could not be acquired through formal instruction, but required hands-on experience and patient guidance. The satisfaction that Eleanor found in her work reflected not just accomplishment of necessary tasks, but also participation in activities that connected her to the eternal human endeavor of creating comfort and security through the application of skill and knowledge to natural materials and social challenges. Her work served purposes larger than individual survival, contributing to community welfare and cultural continuity. The challenges that another year would bring could not be predicted with certainty, but Eleanor faced them with confidence born of proven ability to adapt and thrive regardless of circumstances. The skills she had developed, the knowledge she had accumulated, and the community relationships she had cultivated provided resources for meeting whatever difficulties the future might present. The cottage around Eleanor held the evidence of another year successfully managed through the application of domestic skills and household wisdom. The worn tools, the carefully stored supplies, the completed textile projects, and the general atmosphere of competent management reflected the remarkable efficiency of medieval households that transformed limited resources into abundant living through skilled labor and careful planning. As spring advanced and the rhythms of outdoor work began to reassert themselves, Eleanor carried forward the lessons learned through another winter's intensive indoor activity while preparing to apply her accumulated knowledge to the different challenges that warmer months would bring. The eternal cycle continued, but each repetition built upon previous experience and added new understanding to the wisdom that sustained medieval families. The rhythm that never ended connected Eleanor to countless generations of women who had faced similar challenges while contributing their own innovations and improvements to the accumulated knowledge that made survival possible. Her work was both individual accomplishment and participation in the collective human effort to create civilized life through the patient application of skill and knowledge to the basic requirements of human existence. In the growing warmth of spring morning, surrounded by the evidence of her competence and the promise of another year's opportunities, Eleanor embodied the eternal strength of women who have always found ways to create comfort and security for their families through the patient mastery of domestic arts that transform raw materials into the necessities of civilized life. The day stretched ahead of her, filled with familiar tasks and new challenges, but she approached it with the confidence that comes from proven ability and accumulated wisdom. The rhythm that governed her life would continue with the reliability of natural cycles, but each day would offer opportunities for the quiet accomplishments that make ordinary life extraordinary through the application of skill, knowledge, and the kind of love that expresses itself through ceaseless service to those who depend on our efforts for their welfare and happiness. In this eternal rhythm of medieval life, where each day brought its own demands and each season its own opportunities, Eleanor and countless women like her demonstrated the remarkable human capacity to find meaning and satisfaction in the essential work of creating comfort from hardship, abundance from scarcity, and lasting value from the simplest materials and most basic activities that sustain all human life through the patient, skillful, and loving application of knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that true accomplishment lies not in grand gestures, but in the daily mastery of life's fundamental requirements. Rest now in the understanding that the women who came before us managed extraordinary challenges with ordinary tools, that human ingenuity and determination can transform any circumstances into opportunities for demonstrating the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, and that the rhythm of daily life, though it may sometimes seem overwhelming, carries within it the eternal promise that patient effort applied with skill and love can create beauty, comfort, and lasting satisfaction from even the most humble materials and challenging circumstances, connecting us to the endless cycle of human adaptation and survival that honors both our individual capabilities and our eternal connection to the larger community of humanity that sustains us all through the shared wisdom and mutual support that make life not just possible but meaningful, beautiful, and filled with the quiet satisfaction of work performed with competence, dedication, and love.